Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk about whether I think Teal Swan is a cult leader and whether I think what she has is a cult and does it really matter? Okay, so before I talk about Teal Swan specifically, okay, I do want to talk about the United States, okay, because um, I'm kind of like, it's kind of like with Donald Trump, okay? I'm not really so much interested in focusing on people like Jim Jones, people like Donald Trump, people like Keith Raniere, people like David Koresh. Okay, I understand there could be some really crazy people out there, and I do understand that cults can form and that crazy things happen inside of cults. I understand that. Okay, but I'd also like to look a little bit at how the United States sort of helps that happen. Okay, in other words, how the culture in the United States is sort of fertile ground for these kind of cults to show up. In other words, I'm willing to accept that Jim Jones is a criminal. I'm willing to accept that David Koresh was a criminal, but I also think it's important that we in the United States that we examine how our culture sort of lends itself to these things. Okay, so it's sort of a balance, you know. I don't think we want to place all the blame on these crazy people because I think our culture sort of is almost like a fertilizer that almost allows these people to develop a little bit. It's sort of a balance, okay. And basically, I just want to first talk about before I actually talk about Teal Swan. I want to talk about how even though we are a secular country, okay, on paper, the United States is a secular country and we have a secular constitution. That's on paper, okay? But culturally, even though the Constitution is essentially neutral on people's religion, okay, culturally, we look at the Constitution as protecting the exalted status of being a believer, okay? So culturally, we look at the Constitution as enshrining a special protection, sort of an elevated status, an exalted status for people just because they have a belief. Okay. So culturally, subconsciously, when you're an American, you feel like just by having any belief that you're suddenly sort of raised up in the Constitution and that you're sort of protected as an elevated person. It's sort of an elevated status. So even if it's going to be Satanism or even if it's going to be Scientology or whatever crazy thing, as soon as you believe something, as an American, you feel like you're sort of raised up, sort of exalted, to sort of like a special status. Okay. Whereas I think a more sane, a more secular, a truly secular culture would definitely protect your right to privacy, but would not raise you up, in terms of, the esteem of having a belief. It's like you can believe what you want, but it's like whatever, but we just don't want to police your privacy. Okay. So I think that's a subtle difference, but I think the United States is actually not really culturally secular. Okay. I think we do sort of put a premium and we sort of exalt people for having just any belief. That somehow having a belief sort of raises you up and makes you sort of at a more noble level. And so, in that sense, I think there is kind of there is sort of a fertile ground, sort of a fertilizer in our attitudes towards belief, that we subconsciously feel like having belief is sort of a very noble, very kind of a exalted thing. Um, and that's just part of our culture. So beyond the Constitution, which is secular, I don't really think we're that secular. And so I think when we look at people like Teal Swan, when we look at people like Keith Raniere, when we look at people like David Koresh, we have to understand the United States does sort of have a subconscious boosting of people just because they have a belief. Like, oh, he has a belief. Whoa. It's like, I think in a more ideal world, I think we might just be more neutral about it. And it's not so much, oh, wow, they have this belief, sort of raising them up. It's more like, hey, they have their belief, whatever. But our concern is that we just don't want to police people's private lives. Okay. So I think if you were to take away that boosting, that sort of cultural boosting of people for having a belief, I think that might kind of deflate a little bit some of the, call it the rash of cults. I think if cults are like a rash, I think the rash would go down a little bit if we could just be ourselves as a culture more neutral about what it means to have a belief. It's like, hey, yes, some belief, like whatever, more neutral. I think that would sort of take the intensity down. So that's the extent to which I think we as a culture are responsible, I think, for setting the conditions that allow a lot of cults to form. Okay. And so, I just leave that, for us just to think about. But do I think that Teal Swan has a cult? Okay. Well, I think it's a good question. Okay. Because basically, let's try to first sort of define what a cult really is. Okay, obviously a cult is not just a religion. Okay, a religion by itself is sort of a separatist organization. Okay, any religion, by associating with the religion, you're sort of associating with a kind of like a subculture. It sort of separates you from just the mainstream. Okay, so let's say if I'm a Baptist or if I'm an Episcopalian, I'm in some way in my life, I'm sort of associating with sort of a subculture within the broader mainstream. Okay, so there is sort of a separateness when you become associated with any religion. Okay, and the question is really, how separate is it? Okay, so like say if I'm an Episcopalian, Episcopal is like probably the lightest form of Christianity that you can find. It's more like, on Sunday we go to church and we eat sandwiches, and after church we sit around and have a conversation, and then we just go home. It's like it doesn't really do that much. It's just maybe Sunday and whatever. But maybe other religions, like say if you're a part of, let's say, some Baptist church, maybe you go to a Bible study 3 times a week, and maybe you have harder beliefs, more fundamentalist, and you feel a little more separate from, let's say, the mainstream. Okay, and likewise, more hardcore fundamentalist. So even within Christianity, there are different levels to which you can become sort of separate from the mainstream. Okay, likewise, like say Judaism, like there's some Judaism that is so soft, it's like they go to temple, maybe they have a lunch, and that's it. Okay, there's other Judaism where they get really hardcore in their beliefs and in their customs, and they live very separate. And then within, let's say, Orthodox Judaism, they have like ultra Orthodox, where they're completely separate, and the women have to wear wigs, and whatever. It starts to really it starts to really infringe on your liberties, much more than the country itself would regulate your personal life. So basically, you could say there's almost like a continuum of how religion sort of separates a person from the mainstream. Okay, and at some extreme, okay, religions start to create such a regimen and such a how would you say, the religions create such a discipline in its people, that now they're not really governed by the country they live in. Okay, because the rules of the country are relatively mild. They're now more governed by the rules of their religion. Okay, so in a sense, the religion can rise up to a point where it starts to infringe on your liberties more than what your country infringes on your liberties. Like, let's say just living in a Western country like the United States, there are some limitations on my liberty. I can't just drive at 200 miles an hour on the highway. I can't just walk into a store and just take whatever I want and just I can't just walk into a grocery store and say, hey, I'll pay you guys next week, but I'm going to take some potato chips. So even just in a regular country like the United States, just the country itself does impose a little bit on your liberty. Okay, but just a little bit. But if you get involved in some high demand religion, now the religion starts to demand on your personal life more than what your country actually. Sorry about those dogs. Terrible. My neighbors. Okay, but anyway, so basically, when we look at any religion, we're looking at the degree to which they put a demand on your personal liberty, and they also infringe on your personal liberty more than the country and the mainstream in which you live. Okay, and it gets to a point sometimes where living within the religion is more demanding than, let's say, even living, like, say, in a country like Iran or a country like North Korea. There are some religions that are so demanding, okay, that even a country like North Korea wouldn't be as demanding as that religion. Okay, so we have to decide, at what point does a religion become so demanding and separate you from, let's say, the mainstream of your country, okay, to where you are now in a point where we should call it a cult. Okay, it's just an arbitrary definition. Okay, some people might want to say that the Southern Baptist Church is a cult. Other people might want to say that, I don't know, like some kind of Hasidic Judaism is like a cult. But I guess we have to decide, where do we want to set that temperature, where a religion is demanding on your personal life more than what, let's say, a country like Saudi Arabia or a country like North Korea, whatever. So we have to be honest. There are some groups where just being involved in that group is going to put more of a demand on you than if you were, let's say, in the Marine Corps or if you were in the Army or something like that. Okay, so we ought to pay attention to that. And at some point, we have to ask, when does it cross the line, and how strict are these groups? In other words, what are the consequences if you break the rules? How much would they punish you? How much do they control you? Okay, so like say Jehovah's Witnesses, they have a lot of, they use a lot of guilt and a lot of consequences. They could split up a family. If you break enough rules, they could excommunicate you, and they could make your family members, they can make it very hard for them to maintain contact with you. Okay, so whenever you get into that level of policing, basically, where the religion is policing you more than the country that you live in, okay, at some point we have to call that a cult. Okay, so like say, classic example, Scientology, classic example, Jehovah's Witnesses. They seriously do put consequences and discipline on you, so that if you break their rules and if you violate their norms, you could actually end up in a terrible situation with your family, where your family would basically, turn their back on you or something like that. So I guess using that standard, I think we could say that Scientology probably is a cult. Okay. And probably Jehovah's Witnesses is probably a cult. Okay. I would say Mormonism, it depends. I think some Mormons play the Mormonism and they're able to sort of play it where they have a reasonable amount of personal freedom. I think other Mormons are really trapped, and they really don't really have real liberty. Okay. And if they did exercise their liberty, they'd probably lose their families. So I'd say Mormonism is probably right on the border, probably. But then, so if that's true, and if we want to say those are cults, okay, then how do we compare those, like say, to like Jim Jones, or like say Charles Manson, or like Keith Raniere, or like David Koresh? Okay, I think when we talk about the famous cults where people have been killed, or famous cults where, like say, the Moonies or something like that, where it's so severe that it's almost like, or like even the Hare Krishnas, I think some cults are so extreme that I think that's what a lot of people really mean when they talk about cults, that they're talking about the absolute extreme. Okay, so I think probably what we really are, probably the best policy we should have is we should talk about mild cults and severe cults. Okay, so mild and severe, or mild, moderate, and severe. Okay, so we'd probably want to say that's like Mormonism is probably right on the threshold. Okay, and then we'd probably want to say that Scientology and, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses are probably kind of mild to moderate. Okay, but then people like say David Koresh, or like Jim Jones, or like Keith Raniere, they're getting into more severe. Okay, so I think we want to see it sort of on a continuum. Okay, so looking at it on that continuum, what does Teal Swan's group look like? Okay, so obviously, from what I understand, she has kind of like a little tribe, I guess, or she has had like a tribe where she has people very close to her, and they live kind of their own sort of disciplined life, and they're trying to make the world a better place. And I guess, you could say on some level maybe it's a cult because they live very separate and they have their beliefs and they have their, whatever, their customs and their consequences, their discipline. Okay, but the question is how bad are the consequences? In other words, would Teal Swan, does she have a setup where she would break up a family? Does she have it set up where if you had to, like say, leave her group, that you could no longer, let's say, have contact with like a former spouse or something like that? Would she break up a marriage? Okay. Well, the bottom line, I don't really actually know. Okay. Because I do know that she can be very tough with people in her group. Okay. And she can be very manipulative and she can put guilt on them. But I'm not sure. I haven't heard any evidence that she would break up a family, or she would, let's say, break up a marriage. Let's say if she had a married couple following her, and there was one spouse started, breaking the rules or whatever. I'm not sure that she would actually break up that marriage necessarily as a matter of standard practice. Okay, so I think I would have to know more about the actual mechanics and the actual rules of her group and how the rules are actually enforced before I could say, she's like the equivalent of the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology. Okay, so basically, I think what we're left with is that we know that she does have charisma and she does assume like a position of like leadership. Okay, and she does assume she's sort of like the queen of her little group, and she does have people. Everybody pretty much works for her. So basically, she has that structure where everybody's sort of below her, and she's sort of like the leader. Okay, but I don't know that she has necessarily like the discipline and the system where the consequences would be as severe as, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses, or let's say Scientology. Okay, and like Scientology, they even have an added thing where if you get away from the group and you talk bad about Scientology, they'll actually do things actively to make your life difficult. Okay, so they'll go after you, they'll harass you, they'll put private investigators on you, they'll publish things against your reputation. Okay, so I don't know that Teal Swan is quite at that level. I think if she is a cult, okay, I'd say she's probably a very mild cult. Okay, and if there are incidents where maybe she's encouraged people to commit suicide, or she's gotten in people's heads where they've you know kind of gone crazy or whatever, I still don't think that's systematically as bad as, let's say, Scientology, or let's say Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, so I think what we're left with is, I think a person who assumes a lot of power and assumes a lot of authority over other people. Okay, that's true. But I'm not sure that in the end, those people aren't free to just leave and just, pretty much separate from a group without suffering a lot of consequences. Okay. And I say this because I saw an interview with a person who had been married to Teal Swan and had been her lover. And then he left the group, and he then did an interview with Mormon Stories. And I didn't pick up anything like because he left the group, he was now suffering like major consequences, or the group was actually going after him, or destroying his life or anything like that. And I also didn't pick up any evidence that they try to separate families. Okay, so I guess I'm just going to say I think Teal Swan probably is very authoritative. She's probably cult-like. I guess she's sort of like a cult leader in the sense that she sort of assumes total authority, and she doesn't really allow people to be her peer. Okay, so I mean the group is very authoritarian. But I don't know that the consequences are that terrible for people who break the rules or who want to separate. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and say that, when you look at the United States and how it sort of is sort of as a fertile ground for people setting up like religions and groups, I guess there is just naturally going to be room for those kind of groups to sort of develop and appear. And so I think when we're looking at, what counts as a real cult, or what counts as like a serious cult, okay, I think we need to be looking more at the consequences of what would happen if a person broke the rules, or if a person tried to get away from the group. Okay, and I think Teal's group is probably on the mild side, and unfortunately, in the United States, we have to let people be free to make mistakes and to be involved in bad relationships or get involved in unhealthy, toxic groups. We can't police people's privacy that much, okay, to where we're actually, where the government would actually prevent you from getting involved in some, stupid, whatever stupid group. So, I mean, there has to be some freedom for people to get into bad relationships and to get into toxic groups. Okay, so do I think Teal Swan has a toxic group? Probably toxic. Just like there's a lot of toxic groups out there, a lot of toxic families out there. Okay, and I just don't think it's the government's place to have any opinion on what people do in their private life, in their unhealthy life, unhealthy habits. A lot. It's unhealthy for a person to go to casinos. It's unhealthy for a person to drink too much. There's so much toxic, bad habits out there. I think Teal Swan is probably just another bad habit for those who get involved in her group. But we have to allow room for people to get involved in bullshit. We just have to. And also, I'm sure there are a lot of groups and a lot of bad habits and bad situations out there that are worse than Teal Swan. Okay, I'm sure of it. So my opinion is, just to kind of summarize Teal Swan, I'm not prepared, and by the way, I'm not a psychologist. So when I say diagnose, I'm saying diagnosing as a layperson. Okay. So when I say I diagnose somebody, I'm diagnosing as a non-expert, just as a person who just has an opinion. Okay. So I'm not prepared to diagnose Teal Swan or to look at her as being clinically narcissistic or clinically cluster B or having a personality disorder. I think that there's something a little bit too competent about her. I think she I think people who have personality disorders, they really screw up their lives. Okay, they really, without trying, or with even when they try to prevent it, I think they end up getting into a lot of trouble over and over again. And I think the kind of trouble that Teal Swan's gotten in is more like just more like attention seeking. Like, oh wow, she said something about suicide, and just she kind of plays on the edge of doing things really controversial, but it just sort of plays into her reputation, and sort of kind of like the bad girl, and I think she kind of likes being controversial. So I think she manages her reputation. It's not like she gets herself really into real trouble. Okay. I think Donald Trump almost gets himself into more trouble than Teal Swan does, and even Donald Trump, I think, is still just managing his, just almost like he's managing his, his mystique as like a legendary person, and so I think Teal Swan, I think she's actually more clever than she is stupid, you know what I mean? And I think she's actually very competent. I think she's been actually very successful in sort of managing her reputation, her notoriety, her you know almost like the legend of who she is, so I think that in the end, I think she's a little too competent, a little too successful to be really a personality disorder. Okay. And I also think she's probably not really a cult leader, in the sense that I think if she was a cult, I think it's such a mild cult that it probably doesn't really matter what you call it, and I don't think her cult is as serious as, let's say, a Scientology, or let's say Jehovah's Witnesses. So I guess my final answer is, I think Teal Swan is really, it's an interesting case, because I think there is a little bit of toxicity with her. And I think there is, I think probably being around Teal Swan is probably like being involved in a really dysfunctional family. Okay. But we can't go around sort of like outlawing dysfunctional families. I mean, there has to be room for people to have their dysfunctional lives. And I think that in the end, I think Teal Swan is just like a kind of a folk religious, like kind of like she doesn't have any particular religion, but she's sort of like a folk religious figure, where it's sort of like folk religion. And she's sort of like a very folksy, very uneducated, sort of kind of religious type person. And that I think it's below the level of what I want to call a cult, or what I want to call anything like, say, personality disorder. It's just a very colorful, kind of a controversial person who, gets herself involved in a lot of kind of crazy ideas and sort of crazy beliefs. But I just don't think she's on the level of, like, say, Lori Vallow or Chad Daybell, or like, say, David Koresh, where you're just going to get piling up a lot of dead bodies. I think Teal Swan is a little smarter and has a little more control over her life. And I think she's, not going to get that out of control. And she hasn't shown any track record of getting that out of control, even though she has episodes. And I understand that she's even had like little breakdowns and stuff, but that's just on the level of just regular people, let's say maybe on a little bit on the toxic side, but just not on, like, say, the side where like the legal system has to intervene and, start bringing charges against her, or, whatever. So yeah, I guess my final analysis is, I just think Teal Swan is an interesting person. I think she's a very colorful sort of folk personality, and almost like a folk legend, And I think some of her ideas are interesting. All right. But I think all in all, I just think she's just another kind of colorful person. And frankly, the fact that she's toxic, how is she different from, like, say, Johnny Depp? Okay, take someone like Johnny Depp. He's also a folk person. He's also very colorful. He's also very controversial. Okay, he also has crazy beliefs, I'm sure. And he also sort of lives a very toxic, kind of problematic life. But what are we going to say? Johnny Depp is like some kind of criminal? I mean, no, he's just sort of a colorful, sort of unhealthy, sort of likable, sort of controversial person. And I think Teal Swan is like that, And there has to be room for people to have color and to have a little bit of dysfunction and a little bit of controversy. That's what's within what's allowable in a diverse, free country, And yeah, so. And if there's any like high status or exaltation given to Teal Swan's group, that may be more on us as a culture, that our culture puts into the airspace this idea that as soon as you have any belief, no matter how crazy or how mumbo jumbo, that suddenly you're elevated just because you have a belief. So some of that's on us as a culture. Okay. But Teal Swan herself, I think she kind of she's smart, and she plays within, she plays within sort of the boundaries, and she just has managed not to get herself like into the criminal side where the police need to get involved, or where people end up dead, or families end up broken up, or lawsuits end up arising because she's like splitting up husbands and wives or whatever. And I don't see any real pattern where she's going into the criminality, where she could be actually compared to, like, say, a David Koresh, or Heaven's Gate or whatever. So yeah, I guess I think she's just colorful. I think she's probably just a folk personality. Just a very interesting, sort of uneducated, colorful, sort of folk religious persona. Kind of a fictional character. And in some ways, I think we need people like that. Because they add color to our lives. Yes, there's a price to be paid because there is some dysfunctionality, there is some toxicity, but in the end, I think it's more important for our culture to have color and texture. And people like that add to the richness, I think, of our culture at the expense of some, dysfunction and some toxicity. But that's the balance of life, and I think it's important for people to be real. And I think it's important not just to have educated people out there showing us what folk religion looks like. I think it's important to have folk figures and folk legends, and I think she's one of those. So yeah, thanks for watching, and talk to you in the next video.